Hey guys, Mr. Fabio here. I'm going to read out loud the article that I assigned you to read, mostly because it comes from a high school level book. I modified it, so I took some parts out to make it easier, and I changed some words around, so now I'm going to read it out loud to you. Please take your time with it, and if you are struggling, please reach out. But it's pretty cool. A lot of you spoke about how the North specifically wanted to end slavery, like they were these heroes, and the South wanted to keep slavery. This article will show you that it was a little bit more complicated than that, and maybe clear up some misconceptions we already have. So what you're going to do is you're going to highlight and find the central idea. You're going to highlight the author's claim, and you're going to highlight the new information you learned about the Civil War. Also, the author's claim here is actually located not at the beginning, but closer to the end. So don't let that frustrate you. Okay, so paragraph 1. Lincoln refused to speak badly about the fugitive slave law publicly. He wrote to a friend, "I confess I hate to see the poor creatures hunted down, but I bite my lips and keep quiet." And when he did propose in 1849 as a congressman to abolish slavery in D.C., but he accompanied this with a section requiring police to arrest and return runaway slaves coming into Washington. He opposed slavery, but could not see blacks as equals. So a constant theme in his approach was to free the slaves and send them back to Africa. In his 1858 campaign in Illinois for the Senate against Stephen Douglas, Lincoln spoke differently depending on the views of his listeners. Speaking in the Northern Illinois in July in Chicago, he said, "Let us discard all of this fighting about this race and that race and the other race being inferior. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal." 2 months later in Southern Illinois, Lincoln told his audience, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and the black races. That I am nor ever shall been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarrying with white people." When Lincoln was elected, seven Southern states seceded from the Union or left the United States. Lincoln started fighting by trying to take back the military base at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and 4 more states seceded. The Confederacy was formed, and the Civil War was on. Lincoln's first inaugural address in March 1861 was conciliatory, which means wanted to keep peace, towards the South and seceded states. He said, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." So just pausing here, what is Lincoln's view about slavery? Did he actually want to fight to end slavery? It was only as the war grew more bitter, the more casualties mounted, desperation to win heightened, that Lincoln began to act against slavery. Lincoln moved towards what was popular with his people. Anti-slavery became a popular reason to fight against the South as negative feelings increased. Racism in the North was part of life as slavery was in the South, and it would take the war to shake both. New York blacks could not vote unless they owned $250 in property, a qualification not applied to whites. Frederick Douglass commented, "The Negro has been hidden away like their deformed children when company comes." In July, Congress passed the Confiscation Act, which allowed the freeing of slaves if they fought for the Union. This was not enforced by the Union Generals, which is the North, and Lincoln ignored the rule breaking. Garrison called Lincoln's policy stumbling, halting, prevaricating, irresolute, weak, and besotted. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued January 1st, 1863, it declared slaves free in those areas still fighting against the Union, which is the North, which it listed very carefully, and said nothing about slaves behind the Union lines or fighting for the Union, beyond the Union. Limited as it was, the Emancipation Proclamation spurred anti-slavery forces. By the summer of 1864, 400,000 signatures asked the legislation to end slavery had been gathered and sent to Congress, something unprecedented in history of the country. That April, the Senate had adopted the 13th Amendment declaring an end to slavery, and in January 1865, the House of Representatives followed. The Union Army was open to blacks. So that's the Northern Army, was open to blacks. And the more blacks entered the war, the more it appeared a war for liberation. The more whites had to sacrifice, the more anger there was, particularly among poor whites in the North, who were drafted by a law that allowed the rich to buy their way out of the draft for $300. And so the draft riots of 1863 took place. Uprisings of angry whites in northern cities, their targets not the rich far away, but the blacks near at hand. The Civil War was one of the bloodiest in human history up to that time. 600,000 dead on both sides in a population of 30 million. This is the equivalent in the United States of 1978, with a population of 250 million, of 5 million dead. As the battles became more intense, as the bodies piled up, as war fatigue grew, the existence of blacks in the South, 4 million of them, became more and more hindrance to the South, and more an opportunity for the North. Du Bois, in Black Reconstruction, pointed this out. These slaves had an enormous power in their hands. Simply by stopping work, they could threaten the Confederacy with starvation. Either the South must make terms with its slaves, free them, and use them to fight the North, and no longer treat them as property, or they could surrender to the North with the assumption that the North, after the war, must help them to defend slavery, as it had before. It had been said that black acceptance of slavery is proved by the fact that during the Civil War, when there were opportunities for escape, most slaves stayed on the plantation. In fact, 500,000 ran away, about 1 in 5, a high proportion when one considers that there was great difficulty in knowing where to go and how to live. A minister in Mississippi wrote in the fall of 1862, "On my arrival, I was surprised to hear that our Negroes stampeded to the Yankees or the North last night, or rather, a portion of them. I think everyone, but with 1 or 2 exceptions, will go to the Yankees." Also, in 1865, the South Carolina Also in 1865, a South Carolina planter wrote to the New York Tribune that the conduct of the Negro in the late crisis of our affairs has convinced me that we are all laboring under a delusion. I believe that these people were content, happy, and attached to their masters. But events and reflection have caused me to change these positions. If they were content, happy, and attached to their masters, why did they desert him in the moment of his need and flock to the enemy, whom they did not know, and thus left their perhaps really good masters whom they did know from infancy? Most slaves neither submitted nor rebelled. They continued to work, waiting to see what would happen. When opportunity came, they left, often joining the Union Army. 200,000 blacks were in the Army and Navy, and 38,000 were killed Historian James McPherson says, without their help, the North could not have won the war as soon as it did, and perhaps it could not have won it at all. What happened to blacks in the Union Army and in the northern cities during the war gave some hint to how limiting the freedom would be, even full victory over the Confederacy. Off-duty black soldiers were attacked in northern cities, as in Zanesville, Ohio, in February 1864, where cries were heard to kill the nigger. Black soldiers were used for the heaviest and the dirtiest work, digging trenches, hauling logs and camyon, loading ammunition, digging wells for the white regiments. White privates received $13 a month, while Negro privates received $10 a month. Many Negroes understood that their status after the war, whatever their situation legally, would depend on whether they owned the land that they worked on or would be forced to be semi-slaves for others. Abandoned plantations, however, were leased to former planters and to white men of the North. As one colored newspaper said, the slaves were made serfs and chained to the soil, such as the boasted freedom acquired by the colored man in the hands of the Yankees. Under congressional policy approved by Lincoln, the property confiscated during the war under the Confiscation Act in July 1864 would be given back to the Confederate owners. Dr. John Rock, a black physician in Boston, spoke at a meeting. Why talk about compensating masters? Compensate them for what? What do we owe them? What does a slave owe them? What does a society owe them? Compensate the master? It is the slave who ought to be compensated. The property of the South is by right of the property of the slave. So they didn't give the property to the slaves, they gave it back to the masters. Some land was taken on the grounds of taxes. Some land was taken on the ground the taxes were late and sold at auction, but only a few blacks could afford to buy this. The American government had set out to fight slave states in 1861, not to end slavery, but to keep the country together and keep the country's market value and resources together. So I'm asking you guys to answer in a very casual, small paragraph, what surprised you most? What did you learn that was new to you? And how might this change our perspectives on the Civil War?